Hello and welcome to another edition of Debunking the Vigilant Christian. In today's episode, we learn that being white is synonymous with being a racist, slave-owning piece of human trash. So let's get started. In the beginning of the video, TVC talks about the idea of original sin and how it states in the Bible that the sins of the father automatically transfer to the son. Of course, this was written at a time when an entire family lived under one roof, or in this case, one tent, and where the age difference between you and your mother, or you and your father, was 16 to 18 tops, meaning that in those times you in fact lived long enough to experience your grandfather or even great-grandfather screwing up in some way or another. Next, TVC talks about how predominantly white people societies are responsible for racism and intolerance. The interesting thing about this is that this statement would indeed have been correct when talking about imperial delusions of grandeur. However, TVC conveniently forgets to note that this is largely due to Christianity as well, in the sense that many European nations at the time held the belief that Christianity equaled civilized. Then, TVC goes full Godwin on us and talks about the delusional ideas of the Nazis and their ideas of a white master race. However, there are two problems with this argument of his. The first one is quite obvious, and it's also the same problem that plagues Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, and its host, Ben Stein, of which TVC is apparently a great fan of. Put simply, you can't actually condemn others for thinking they're part of an elite group of people when you yourself are a member of a divinely appointed elite group that has some sort of spiritual insight the rest of us don't have. This, incidentally, is also true of Christianity, as relayed in the Book of Romans, which also shares the same elitist delusions of spiritual insight. Secondly, TVC makes it sound as though the idea of being a superior group of people somehow has something to do with skin color when, in fact, and this fact apparently seems to have escaped his thought process while making his video, there are, and were, a number of different states and cultures that shared a similar delusion. For example, we have the flawed idea of American exceptionalism, the idea held by the Romans that only their culture was civilized. China, up until around 1900, believed it was the center of the world, and there's ample evidence to suggest that the Mayans had a similar mode of thinking. That order and civilization could only exist where a god-king was present, and that everything else was just naked savages living in the trees. Another issue I now want to talk about, even though TVC talks about it very early in this video, is the issue of white folk and slavery. Again, he apparently conflates being white with owning slaves, even though slavery is much older than any sort of American or European imperialism, and certainly not limited to these two continents either. But what I find especially interesting is that he talks about slavery specifically in relation to Canada. Now, it's not to say that Canada hasn't had its fair share of slavery, because it had. And before Canada became a democracy, it's pretty certain that most dukes and marquises had black and native slaves. But the thing is, slavery in Canada was never as bad or as prevalent as, say, for example, in the American South, or when the Spaniards and Portuguese used black and native slaves for mining gold and silver. Lastly, being a French-Canadian himself, I find it astounding that, in relation to ethnicity, TVC decides to harp on slavery and the flaws of declaring yourself better by some divine order rather than, say, civil rights or ethnic inequality. This is compounded by the fact that, astonishingly, he actually admits to the troubled history of his country, but fails to realize the obvious legal implications of this in the modern age. This is especially interesting seeing how French Canadians received legal recognition in 2006 after decades and centuries of unfair treatment by the British government. And as a French Canadian, TVC should know about it and mention this at some point. But I guess those are just pesky facts that get in the way of his ill-conceived message. And lastly, I am obviously obligated to mention the elephant in the room here. The fact that TVC is going on a long rant about slavery and racism being satanic and evil and corrupt and you know the drill, even though, according to his own damn Bible, both of these things are A-OK with God. However, I didn't cover this as I didn't want to make another mere bashing video, and also because there are enough videos on YouTube that deal with slavery and racism in the Bible, and you can check those out if you want to. So enjoy this festive time, get your gingerbread hearts and stars, grab a good book, watch a good movie, and we'll see each other in the next video.